I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Is that okay, everyone? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dominic Sims. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the International Code Council. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone for joining us today, both here in our DC office and those participating virtually. Thank you all for being with us this afternoon for our Building Safety Month panel discussion on the progress of the White House National Initiative to Advance Building Codes. This year marks the second anniversary of the initiative, which was created to enhance and promote the adoption and implementation of strong building codes across the federal government and ultimately the nation for improved safety, resiliency, and sustainability. Today, we take great pride in discussing the success and the achievements we have realized so far, and more importantly, what lies ahead. To kick us off, it's my pleasure to introduce Mary Frances Repko, Deputy National Climate Advisor to the President's Office. Mary Frances joined the President's team at the start of the 2023 year, following a nearly 30-year career on Capitol Hill. In her White House role, she has the simple tasks of coordinating the policymaking process with respect to domestic climate policy issues, coordinating domestic climate policy advice to the President, ensuring that domestic climate policy discussions and programs are consistent with the President's stated goals and that those goals are being effectively pursued. And then finally, monitoring the implementation of the President's domestic climate policy agenda. Just prior to joining the administration, she was the staff director for the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, where she played an integral role in crafting and negotiating both the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Those two laws provided monumental investments and programs for addressing the climate change, providing record amounts of federal assistance for building energy codes by the Department of Energy and hazard resiliency via FEMA. She and her team deeply understand that energy efficiency and hazard mitigation benefits from the adoption and implementation of energy and building codes. Understanding why the administration is prioritizing their wider adoption and use and has insights into the progress made to date and what lies ahead for the national investment to advance building codes. We are honored and excited to have her here with us today. Welcome, Mary.
In my next life, I'll be a little taller. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. Thank you so much for that really kind introduction. And I just wanted to say on behalf of the Biden-Harris administration, thank you for leading the way on the implementation of the White House's national initiative on the implementation of advanced building codes, and for pushing forward advances to improve building safety as we face an historic climate crisis. As was mentioned, my role as a Deputy National Climate Advisor to President Biden, I'm really eager to be here at the International Code Council and here with FEMA to celebrate Building Safety Month and, as you discussed, the 2-year anniversary of the National Initiative to Advance Building Codes. Your efforts to advance resilience and emissions reduction are integral to those milestones. Almost 2 years ago, the President launched this initiative, and that's because he knows the value of modern building codes and high-performance standards. Buildings contribute more than 1/3 of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Stronger building codes and performance standards are proven to save lives, particularly in extreme heat and cold, reduce property damage, lower utility bills for families, cut climate pollution, and particularly help us ensure that our buildings are able to survive extreme weather that we're experiencing more frequently and more intensely. President Biden also knows that we must move quickly to advance this work to ensure that buildings and communities are prepared for extreme weather and for a worsening climate crisis. I'm also delighted, and I'll just take a personal aside, to be here in this building today. As I mentioned to some of you that I met as I arrived. As was mentioned, as the staff director of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, our committee did significant work on both the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. One of the pieces of the infrastructure law is a program called Reconnecting Communities, which is about trying to bridge the gaps that, in particular, urban highway systems made through a number of historically minority neighborhoods. The buildings in which we're now located were the example that we kept coming back to as we were trying to explain the merits of this program to Senate colleagues as we were writing the statute. They would say, what do you mean by capping and building on top of it? And I would say, well, have you seen those buildings in the 200 block of Massachusetts Avenue Northwest? Those are examples of what we're trying to do and trying to achieve. And as part of that statute, we delivered an incredibly targeted investment, and with your partnership, we have lots to be able to move forward and to achieve. The national initiative is an all-of-government approach, which is now made up of 20 agencies, of which we in the administration are so proud, and they're dedicated to the advancement of building safety, resiliency, and emissions reduction in every building connected to the federal government. The initiative is also supporting local communities and energy code adoptions with the programs that we've described in the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law and the $1.2 billion that those statutes have made available to cities, states, and organizations who are actually training builders to build these future, more resilient buildings. And we're seeing the success of the initiative all across the country, of which you all should be quite proud. For example, last year, Louisiana adopted the latest energy and building codes. The Louisiana home builders advocated for the adoption of those codes, realizing their importance for resiliency and for energy efficiency. In April, HUD and USDA announced new energy efficiency standards for 150,000 new construction homes financed by those agencies each year. Last year, our federal family stood up the first ever National Climate Resilience Framework, which I was proud to work with the interagency to develop, to serve as a clear statement of President Biden's climate resilience priorities. So overall, the work of the National Initiative to Advance Building Codes is critical to our shared success as we tackle the climate crisis. It's all of your commitment to continued partnership and leadership that will ensure that American buildings and our communities, in the end, weather the storm and come out stronger. My sincere thanks to you for your efforts, and I'm looking forward to a very exciting panel this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary Frances. Next, we are moving to our panel discussion. And now I'd like to introduce the U.S. Fire Administrator, Dr. Lori Moore-Morrell, to lead our panel discussion. And Dr. Moore-Morrell was appointed by President Biden as the U.S. Fire Administrator in 2021. She has a distinguished background, having served nearly 3 years as the president and chief executive of the International Public Safety Data Institute, a foundation she established following her retirement from a 26-year tenure as a senior executive with the International Association of Firefighters. She's been terrific in her work to support strong building codes, adoption, implementation at all levels of government. We are honored to have her with us today, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Moore-Morrell to lead our panel discussion.
Very good. Thank you so much, Mr. Sims. I appreciate that. I'm going to adjust this because I'm vertically challenged, so we can move that around just a little bit. Good afternoon, everyone. And we're welcoming our panel up here to the front. So I'm really excited about this. And I tell you, I'm grateful for the ICC's support of what we have come to call at the National Fire Service level our National One Voice effort, where all of our national organizations stand together and speak with one voice. And building codes have become part of that, along with our resilience activities around climate, around our initiatives for recruitment of firefighters across the nation, many, many other things that we have taken up together. And so thank you to the ICC for always being there and being part of that One Voice effort. So I would like to continue those kudos, of course, for the continued work in advancing am I talking into this like you'd like me to? Okay. Advancing safe and sustainable, affordable, resilient homes. I really like that as a mission, and Dominic, I know that you lean into that often, and I really love the theme, Mission Possible. I suspect I know where that came from. But Mission Possible, and there's really no time like the present to advance building codes at all levels of government, not just the federal, because if it doesn't go local, we don't have any movement. And as we focus on the White House National Initiative to advance building codes, we have to acknowledge that building community resilience is only a theory without the adoption, implementation, and enforcement of building codes in all land areas. And so with that, there are areas that are threatened by wind, there are areas that are threatened by water, there are areas that are threatened by fire, and now these threats are changing. As climate change impacts, there are impacts that are changing. Our baseline risk are changing across the landscape of our nation. Just watch the news and you'll see it. After every event, a flood, a fire, a wind event, you'll hear people say, "Why, this has never happened here before." And that may be true, but it's going to happen again. And this is why we have to continue to lean in to building resilient communities and taking it past theory to actual implementation and practice. And so that's where we're going to talk with this panel today. So let me now introduce our panel members, and we're going to start with Carl Fippinger, who is a Vice President of Fire and Disaster Management for the ICC. He also works with the Government Relations Department of the ICC and leads our national fire and emergency management activities. And Carl also sits on the FEMA National Advisory Council. So Carl, thank you very much for being part of the panel today. We also have Mariah Lackensing, and I checked how to say that. And Mariah, thank you so much for also joining today. Mariah works with the code as a code specialist in the Commercial Building Division of Lands Development Service in Fairfax County, Virginia. And she has over 16 years of code enforcement experience. And Mariah is also newly re-elected president of the Women in Code Enforcement and Development of Virginia. So welcome to you, Mariah, as well. Dr. Carlos Martin is the director of the Remodeling Future program in the Joint Center of Housing Studies at Harvard University. And Dr. Carlos also lectures at the Graduate School of Design and has over 25 years of experience in researching housing technology and physical quality of existing homes, and is a fellow at the Brookings Institute. So welcome to you as well, Dr. Martin. And Justin Cates, welcome to you as well. Last but not least, we are really grateful to have the president of the International Association of Emergency Managers on the panel. So welcome to you. And Justin serves as the treasurer also of the National Association of Public Safety GIS, or NAPSG Foundation, and is a member also of the FEMA National Advisory Council. So thank you for your service in that arena. So this is our panel. Please join me in welcoming them to the front. So for the panelists this afternoon, we're going to, if it's all right with you all, I will not throw you curveballs, but I am going to be a bit random, okay? So with that, let me start with Justin, if you don't mind. If I can start with you, in what ways, Justin, can emergency managers and code and building officials collaborate to reduce disaster risk in our communities? What's the power of collaboration and how can that happen?
That's a great question. So Emergency managers across the country, particularly at the local level, are typically responsible for very small offices. You know, might be one person, two person, and we've seen historically that much of their attention is focused towards the response of the variety of disasters that occur across the country, which are happening more often, as you mentioned. But unfortunately, we do not get to dedicate the amount of time that's really necessary to mitigate those risks in our communities. And I always look back to my years as an emergency manager in municipal government, both in the city of Nashua, New Hampshire, and the city of Somerville, Massachusetts, and the partnership that I had with my building official and my fire marshal. Those two individuals were behind the scenes trying to reduce all the risks that I was going to have to deal with as the emergency manager for my community. And I couldn't have been a better cheerleader for them to try and promote their initiatives and the support that they had for trying to support those building codes across our community. There are plenty of opportunities for emergency managers and those building officials to partner. And one of the key things is to work together on plan reviews, try and promote the idea of sharing information across both of those departments so that they're aware of what things the emergency manager is looking at, those risky areas in the community, and then those concerns that the building official is trying to ensure that our first responders, our emergency managers are aware of. So there should be open lines of communication, and it's a really important partnership that across the country, emergency managers and building officials should be working together.
You know, you said something there, Justin, that got my attention. You said we focus often on response. I think that's true.
Mm-hmm.
How are we going to get in front of that? How do we get in front of always being in response mode to everyday emergencies that occur, that are local or even state, but even nationally declared disasters? How do we do that?
Well, I think a lot of it's about capacity, and we know at the local level in emergency management, some of our best capacity builders are our partnerships with state emergency management and FEMA. FEMA has done unbelievable work in the last few years to try and promote additional work around supporting building codes. We saw most recently with the work that they've done around the building resilience in communities, the BRIC program, special money just for building code support to help those jurisdictions promote building codes, enforce building codes, capacity that many jurisdictions don't have. So we'd like to see more of that. I think that's a way to get that mitigation focus rather than the response focus.
I like that. I like that. Let me go to Mariah. Mariah, you have quite the passion, from what I've read about you, for recruiting not only diversity but young people into doing building codes advancement and advocacy. So how are you doing that, and why is that important?
So thank you. That was a great question. And I have been enforcing, as we mentioned, for about 16 years now in some form or fashion. And so over the past few years, I've seen this change and improvement enter the space where, and I'm not quite sure if it's because of change as a result to COVID and how the industry has shifted during that time, or if it's just changing with the times, but we're starting to see much younger code professionals enter into this space, and not just younger, but more diversity among them. And so currently I'm an instructor for the Virginia Department of Health and Community Development, and I teach the administrative portions of the building code. And because it's a required course to be certified in Virginia, I am seeing firsthand what those new professionals coming into the field are looking like. And every class that's being taught, 60 to 80 students, a third of them are women. And then a third of them are people of color. And so for me personally, that is exciting. It's exciting because it's important for representatives in the code officials industry to be more reflective of the communities that we represent. And so I'm not just seeing that change at the state level, but I'm also seeing it nationally when I attend the annual ICC conference and I am collaborating and networking with code officials from across the nation. I am seeing this change. I am seeing so many more women. I'm seeing so many people of color, and that just brings me complete joy. And the cool thing about young professionals is that they're coming into the field thinking outside of the box. They have fresh ideas. They have new and alternative approaches to dealing with and enforcing the building code. They are questioning the status quo, right? And so along with that, they are more inclined to be in partnership with our stakeholders. And well, here in Virginia, we call that the Virginia way. But they are also more inclined to be in partnership with government agencies to efficiently and effectively improve the places that we work, live, and play. And so, in my opinion, the young people are the mission possible.
Oh, I like that. Very good, very good. And where can we continue, just to give you a follow-on there? If I and any of us in our communities, where do we find them? If I want to go recruit, if I want to go get someone, and what's the first thing you would say to them to get them interested?
So honestly, where you find them is kind of what Wicked of VA does. We go to the local schools and then to the colleges. We are presenting, we're figuring out what programs that they have, and then figuring out how our mission fits into what their goals are, and we're pulling them in that way. We educate them on the code profession, because the reality is that we are in this transitional period where our code officials are retiring. So we need them. We need them to come in, and then in the schools, if you're getting them right in school, then you're getting them before they enter the workforce, and that's that sweet spot.
I like that. Good, good. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Martin, I'm going to come to you. Based on your experience, and I want to sort of set the stage here, let's talk about post-disaster. So post-disaster and rebuild, how important maybe, let's talk about building back with codes, which doesn't happen in a lot of places. And then what's the cost of not building back to code? What do we build back without code? Talk to us about that.
Sure. So we're dealing with repeat scenarios in most places now, right? So when your comment earlier about the fact that some place will say, "Oh, we never had this before," well, that's actually not true anymore, right? In most parts of the country, for a wide range of hazard scenarios. I mean, we had a hurricane in L.A. last year. I mean, come on, let's step up to the plate here. So in post-disaster scenarios, it's important to remember that certain communities have lower capacity and are going to need a lot more help. And that includes help on the pre-disaster side. In all the work that I've done, I've always looked at the fact that we spend for every $1 we spend in mitigation, we spend about $16 in recovery. And that recovery is never complete. It doesn't make all communities whole. So we have long-term strategies that we need to start thinking about that include much more investment at the federal side, but also at the local level, really making sure that we're investing. And part of that is on the code side. I should say, we're forgive the pun, there is a perfect storm, right, of increasing hazards and not only hazard risks, but actualized hazards, and a national affordability crisis, housing affordability crisis. There are several in this city who would like to create attention around that. I think if we think a little more strategically, we realize the fact that if we invest more pre-disaster, the life cycle of what we have to spend as a federal government, state government, local government, as an individual homeowners, tenants, would be reduced if we were actually a little more thoughtful about that process. I like to say that if we bite the bullet now, we'll spare ourselves from being killed by that bullet a couple years later. So it's important to think through about that life cycle.
That is interesting that you said that. And you use the word investment, because that's what you just described too. It's pay now or pay later, right? But give us how do we convince our government officials at the local level, state level? Because once we take the national code and it gets sent down to the states for implementation, they send it down further to the local governments, and it gets cherry-picked, as we all know, for implementation. How do we change that paradigm for them to see it as an investment?
So I'm going to wear my historian hat I can claim a little bit of multidisciplinarity in my background. If you look back at the Great Chicago Fire, if you look back at the Great Mississippi Flood in 1927, part of the reason that governments made investments, not only in a wide range of infrastructure investments, but also in building codes, was because their communities demanded it, and their insurers of those communities and the properties demanded it. So it's, unfortunately, we often only act when there's crisis. So in those events when there is crisis, we'd like to think that there's rebuilding that's going to occur after that. So a lot of it is just demand. It's just the consumer, the homeowner, the communities actually demanding that there be change.
So that kind of demand is how we're going to stir it up, and that is an education process, perhaps, that people know they can demand it, right?
I would definitely, you're talking to somebody at Harvard. I'm all in favor of education.
Yeah, there you go. That was a softball for you. All right, Carl, I'm going to come to you now. And so I know all of these questions I've asked previously, you were itching because I could see your leg shaking over here. So you wanted to talk, I know. Carl is very passionate about this subject. And so, Carl, with that, what I would like to ask you is, how do we educate? What is our role? And what is the role of the national initiative to advance building codes that the president introduced now 2 years ago? How's that changed the conversation among building safety advocates here in the U.S., and why does that remain an important focus?
It's an enormous piece, and I think the fact that the United States government is taking a lead position on this now changes the conversation quite a bit for us, because myself, my colleagues, we spend a lot of time with our partners, grassroots efforts of going out and working the bottom up. I think today, knowing that the White House is behind this, the Federal Emergency Management Agency is behind it as a leader, Department of Energy is another significant leader here, as well as I believe up to now 20 federal departments and agencies have now implemented and taken a look also at not only before they implemented, but assessing themselves to be able to understand where they are with codes, where they need to be, and now have an implementation plan to move those forward over the next several years. So I think that's the education that we've been looking for. I mean, I would like to think that we do a pretty good job of that here at the ICC and working with our industry partners to be able to make education happen on an everyday basis. But now that we've got the support of the White House, we have the support of FEMA, we have the support of DOE, and all those other departments and agencies, it's really changed the conversation, not only here nationally, but also internationally for my colleagues that participate in international things like COP24. So.
That's excellent. So, Carl, with that in mind, I'm just going to give you an example. I was in a conversation yesterday with the Weather Channel, and they said to me, we were talking about people understanding how to evacuate under a disaster event or a declaration, and they said, you know, we have done surveys, and people, it's like 70%, it was some outrageous number of people who don't even know what county they live in. So when they have county projections around you need to move or take shelter, and you don't know what county you live in, how are we going to change people's mindsets around what kind of building they're living in and whether or not it's built to code?
Well, it's going to be an interesting challenge. I mean, I just had this conversation with a gentleman that you and I both know, Dave Shue, who happens to be Napa County's fire administrator, and he brought up to me the other day this concept of, hey, you guys have and have partnered on this ICC 500 shelter concept, which I know my colleague Ryan, who's in the audience, knows quite a bit about as well from the seismic and the tornado side, as well as Dr. Mark Levitan as well, too. I will tell you that that's going to be an interesting piece because the public education piece on this only goes so far. It has to be at a fairly elementary level in terms of the communication and the language that's used. It has to be repeated, but also it really comes down to being, are we in a notice event or a no notice event? We talk about this a lot to do with hurricanes versus wildfires, tornadic activity, seismic. I can tell you that there's got to be that plan to be able to take care of yourself at the individual residence level, build that protection into your home, going to your question, and if all of that fails, then have another place to go so you're not caught like we saw in what happened in Maui and the Lahaina wildfires as well. So that's going to be an ongoing task for us, but the more that we can push this down to the residential level, the community level, and have a shelter of last resort to be able to go to that is proximal to those buildings, I think that's going to be really important for us.
And who is the spokesperson around that? Who can be the spokespeople around?
It's a coalition. It really is. I mean, and that's what we do a lot. That's why we're here today. I think as part of Building Safety Month, we're celebrating the coalitions that we've built over decades, and trying to get to your point earlier on the whole page of one voice. I think we have done that. I say that collectively, we, through your leadership in the fire service. And the question then becomes, why can't we do that in other places, like for building codes? So that's what we're here to accomplish.
I like that, Carl. Thank you. Justin, may I come back to you? So earlier we talked about, and this is just sort of taking another stream of what Carl was saying. You mentioned mitigation. We said we want to get out of response mode, but that's going to take some pre-mitigation. How do we teach people what mitigation looks like? We use the word, we know what we're thinking, but that's not a word people understand. When you ask them to do mitigation on risk around their homes or their landscape, how do we teach mitigation?
It's a great question. And yeah, mitigation is one of those terms that, depending on how you're using it, you could be talking about mitigating the impacts of an event that's already happening. But in the sense that we're using it, we're talking about mitigating that risk, trying to prevent death and injuries, trying to reduce the amount of property damage. And that is a tough thing for folks to do, especially when we look at who is most disproportionately impacted by these types of events. May not have the resources to implement those types of mitigation measures in their homes or in their businesses or other locations. Some of the things that we've seen is really strong outreach from our building safety departments, our code enforcement departments. They are able to provide what I call sort of the easy, quick hits that you can, as a homeowner, go out and do to try and protect your property. And keep it safe inside, so that there's not significant injuries for the types of hazards that you deal with in your location. Again, though, as I mentioned earlier, in addition to emergency managers typically being one-person shops, so are code enforcement and code officials, and typically they don't have the bandwidth or capacity to do all the outreach that they would hope for. So that's another example of partnering with your emergency manager, working to try and share that information. We go out in the emergency management community to teach people about emergency preparedness. Why not include some mitigation techniques as part of that awareness that we're doing out in the community? So, those are just some of the examples on how I think we can push the mitigation measures and try and promote that to the broader community.
That's good. So teaching people what right looks like, right, by example. I know, like you just said, looking at it from different perspectives. If I live in a high-rise, then my mitigation might be making sure my door is self-closing, or I've got, whatever sprinkler retrofit, or checking those things in my building. But if I live in a WUI area, wildland urban interface, that mitigation is totally different. And so making sure we talk about what right looks like in the land area, and I think you hit on that. I just want you to focus once more on community engagement, direct community engagement. Do we have enough people in the emergency management, or even the fire service community, to be able to do that?
No, unfortunately not. And so, as has been discussed a couple of times about coalitions, that's why you need to partner between emergency management and your building officials. Also consider some of the other departments that are out there doing education. We even see some examples in schools as part of fire safety, trying to promote mitigation techniques around fire prevention. Again, can we expand those to other types of natural hazards so that children, as they're going up through school programs, understand some of the techniques that they should be thinking about to try and reduce that risk in their homes. So yeah, it's got to be a coalition in order to make this work.
I love it. Thank you, Justin. Thank you. Mariah, may I come back to you, please? So last fall, I understand that Fairfax County, Virginia, launched the Resilient Fairfax Plan, which has a strong focus on mitigation in the built environment. How do these efforts translate into practice around building codes? So how successful are you being, and how does that translate into building codes?
So Resilient Fairfax is the county's action plan to proactively work towards addressing both the cause and the impact of climate change. By reducing the effects of climate change, we're trying to approach that in a holistic way. Climate mitigation in addition to climate adaptation and resilience. As a result, That makes our communities safer, more durable community buildings to withstand what we have been talking about, which is the extreme weather, strong storms, extreme heat, and flooding. And over the past decade, those experiences of environmental shifts have driven our changes in what we are proposing in code change. So we are seeing more code changes as it relates to energy efficiency and building resiliency. And our building codes are updated every 3 years to kind of keep up with the technological advancements in addition to this continued climate change. And by adopting the modern building codes and standards, we reduce the property damage in wake of natural disasters, and in return influence the safety and well-being of our citizens and the economy. It is invaluable that code officials continue to have a seat at the decision-making table along with FEMA and HUD, and in our state and local, and at the state and local level. The ability to combat the community resilience at the national level starts at the local level. It starts with your permit techs, your plan reviewers, your inspectors, your building code officials. We are the bridge between the community and what the designers are doing to adapt our buildings and make these changes. And so we translate what needs to happen and what we're seeing out in the field to code changes. And so that's basically what Fairfax Resilient is, and it's also kind of a mimic of what's happening at the national level. So the National Initiative to Advance Building Codes is pretty much the same thing Fairfax is doing, but just at the local level.
Excellent. Thank you. That's fantastic. And every 3 years.
Every 3 years. We
Do you
update the
have any
codes.
areas of the community that are grandfathered that don't come to code or have not been retrofitted?
So we don't have any areas that specifically are not addressed by the code because we have the International Existing Building Code. And so that is a code that allows for us to have these historic structures in these existing buildings, but kind of be able to change the use of them or make adaptations with some sort of modern technology without changing completely the building or forcing it to be completely in compliance with the new code.
Excellent. So that's front of mind, I'm sure.
Right,
All of
always.
that. Always. Very good. Thank you. Dr. Martin, let me come back to you, please. You mentioned earlier the role of insurance. How is the role of insurance, and I know we're seeing it more and more, hurricane-ridden Florida to wildfire California and Colorado, more and more the insurers are not renewing. They are not based on the risk calculations, based on us continuing to build toward risk across our nation and amplifying actually the risk that our people are choosing to live in those spaces. What's the role of insurance?
All right. Well, the insurance industry has been the instigator often of building codes. I mean, this is what happened in Chicago after the Great Fire. The first municipal building code was actually a fire code because of the Great Fire. So it's important. That's a very important tool. It's one of the sort of industrial drivers of asking for change in local communities. But it also brings up a very important point. I'm really happy Mariah brought up the IEBC because I think we have to remember that 99% of the buildings that exist this year or already exist that will be built that will be covered. So we have to think a little bit more about the performance bar in which we live in now. I, as the director of the Remodeling Futures program, I'm very conscious of the fact that the average age of the American home, for example, is at its oldest in history, 41 years old. So I always liken that to be entering into midlife crisis. Maybe because I'm old as well, but I also realize, well, if we have the oldest aged home properties in this building, in the country, they also have to be considered. And insurers have often been helpful in helping bring existing buildings up to a higher performance bar. And we've certainly seen them doing that, maybe not to an IEBC trigger, but potentially at least to a higher level of performance to protect communities who are particularly the most vulnerable, low-income households, communities, households of color, tend to live in the older existing buildings, right? So we want to make sure that they have some expectations of their building's performance as well.
So you think these insurers who are choosing not to renew policies in these, I'll just fire prone for right now, we'll just deal with that. Is that going to cause change in how we build resilient communities or how we address the building codes?
Absolutely will, by force. We're going to have to make changes to how we build new buildings as well as how we address existing buildings as well as where buildings are located. So it's a broader land use question as well. I don't want to, obviously don't want to poo-poo the insurance industry, but I also don't want to give them too much credence because so much of what's important isn't the economic valuation of our properties as much as it is the cultural, social, economic significance that it means to the individuals who live and work in these buildings. That's priority for me. And so I think insurers can help instigate this by threatening to leave and then coming back in once they've gotten certain concessions, but also the communities being the drivers of these changes in the long term.
I appreciate that. And so let me ask you a different question from a cost perspective. Safe and affordable housing. You mentioned vulnerable communities, poor, people of color, in particular in our inner city areas. Safe and affordable housing, is that mutually exclusive?
Safe and affordable housing should not be mutually exclusive. It should be a right. And I do believe that there is a tension between these things that it exists in some ways, right? Certain requirements, technical engineering and design requirements for safety will cost more. In the long run, they may not cost more. Remember, I'm old enough to remember that in the 50s and 60s, people said builders were actually building new homes and marketing them as saying, this home is built to code. Like that was a sales pitch, right? This is before the advent of wide range residential building codes. So I feel like there is a lot of learning curve that can happen that can reduce that tension. But ultimately, if we make investments in the public sector as well as the private sector, which includes the insurers, I'm sounding like I'm an insurance person. I'm not by any stretch. You just ask insurance people. But I think there has to be a shared risk distribution to benefit equally everybody.
I like that, shared risk distribution, okay? So Carl, let's come back around to you. I want to talk just a little bit about how we've continued to build toward risk. I said that earlier. And I'd like you to take that up because you've been really a vocal advocate for the wildland-urban interface and how we are building not only interface but intermixed communities, how these homes are distributed, and yet not built to code. Talk about that, Carl. What's the passion? What are we going to do? How do we change that trajectory?
Well, I mean, I think the reality of the situation is that, urban sprawl is here. People are trying to spread out. I mean, granted, Arlington County, Roslyn, Fairfax County looked much different 20, 25 years ago here in Northern Virginia than it does today. But even as you start to get an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours away from here, you're seeing people move out, particularly with COVID as a driver of that because of the whole idea of virtual work. So we're finding more and more people are trying to spread out, get away from the urban centers, spend a little bit more time in nature and interfacing with nature. But on the other side of that, though, comes a trade-off. And one of the things that I've said, and you and I have discussed quite a bit, is that not only are we moving out, as I'm discussing here, and starting to build in the wildland-urban interface and an intermix, but it's also finding us due to climate-related concerns in a changing environment, right? So it's kind of a dual-edged sword because it comes at you from both directions, right? So at the end of the day, I think that the answer there is going to be being conscious of where you're building. I don't know that we want to take up the conversation of hurricane-prone areas and people wanting to build by the shore. I mean, I think that is a natural thing that we have seen, particularly here in the East Coast, over the years, and people will continue to build and want to be at the beach. But in particular, when we talk about the wildland-urban interface, we can do more, and it goes back to your point on education. It goes back to working with our partners on advanced building materials, starting to talk about ignition-resistant construction, how we can prepare our homes in that 0 to 5 foot zone or the 0 to 100 foot zone for defensible space, and being able to live communally with nature, because fire is going to happen and it's going to find us more and more often. So hopefully that kind of drives to.
I think that's perfect until I argue with you that the folks that live there like their trees. So getting them to reduce fuel around their homes is going to be challenging. Do you agree?
I do, but I think also when you look at a code like the International Wildland Urban Interface Code, and it works with the other international codes families of the building code, the residential code, even the existing building code, you start to look at the trade-offs that the IWIC provides, and it takes all those factors into account. What's your fire hazard severity? How many days a year are you in that environment, right? More and more we're seeing, our threshold for higher extreme is right around on or at 8 days a year, right? I mean, I just spent 8 days in Maui, and every one of those days was an extreme higher fire danger day. So I'll say that we've got the trade-offs in there where you determine your risk, then you start to take a look at your water supply and your infrastructure, your roadways, and then you start to look at your topography, you look at your defensible space, and then you build accordingly. But you have to also do that with an eye to the future to say what it is today is not necessarily going to be what it is tomorrow. So building to that higher level of ignition resistance now and saving the money with the IWIC. Our standard discussion is for every $1 spent in terms of money today to be able to build a code, you're looking at a general return of about $11 in avoided risk in the future. For the WUI code, it's slightly lower. It's $4 to $6, maybe as high as $8. But that is how you avoid risk. So that you use that sliding scale, and it's a scalable solution, and you come back to that and say to yourself, you know what, here's where we are today, maybe I edge that out and build a little bit more resistant for the future. Maybe I take my defensible space out a little bit farther, a little bit more of my building materials. But anyway, that's the answer I'll give you.
I like that, because between you and Dr. Martin, what I'm envisioning is this dashboard of risk variables and buttons that can be turned given whether it's shared risk or something that I individually need to take on as risk and mitigation. Justin, back to you. I can make, as an individual, I have choices. I have power in whether or not I am resilient and living in resilient housing in some cases. Not all, but many people, individuals, have a role to help make themselves savable. Would you agree, Justin?
Yeah, this is always a tough challenge out there, because we definitely recognize that many of the individuals that are in some of our most risky areas in our jurisdictions may not have the resources to implement many of the mitigation techniques that we look for. They're typically in older building stock. They may not be benefiting from the modern building codes that we're up here promoting today. And then there's another perspective out there that looks at individual resilience and family resilience, and you'll see that many of these folks are more resilient than many of the people within the community, because for so long they've tried to withstand sort of the day-to-day issues that they're encountering when a flood or a fire or a hurricane is impacting them. They figure out solutions to it. Again, I think, when we look at the emergency management perspective and what we can do to help those families, I think it comes down to two big areas. The first is, how can we support them with funding and resources and technical assistance before disasters occur? And we see a lot of movement at the federal level to support our states and local communities with grant programs and technical assistance that only have been really popular within the last few years. So that's a big deal. The second area is after a disaster, your emergency managers and your recovery officials have to know how to reach out to those communities, how to provide them with the right resources to build back in a way that has modern building codes and other mitigation techniques for the risks that they deal with in their community. And we see with FEMA's public assistance program for many of the municipal, county, state facilities that need to be rebuilt after disaster, they're built back stronger. using modern building codes and mitigation techniques so that those community centers, those places that they rely on day to day, are available for their use even during a disaster. So emergency managers and building officials need to consider both the pre-disaster and the post-disaster and be ready to support those individuals and families with modern building codes.
Absolutely. Good, good. Thank you for that. I saw, Mariah, you were looking at me on that question. I know you want to say something. Let me give you that opportunity, and then we're going to go to our last closing statements for you guys. So, Mariah?
I was looking at you, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to say something.
Okay. So tell us about vulnerable communities. If we say, yes, some people have the capability to make themselves savable, other people do not have the means to help make their risk lower where they live, because the building itself may fail before, if something goes badly, before they even have a chance to get out of it. So where's the difference, and what can you do in Fairfax County to mitigate that?
Well, I don't want to basically ditto what Justin said, but
You can if
kind
you
of
want.
ditto.
Okay.
But I guess from where I'm sitting, it's the lack of resources, and those communities continue to stay in that pocket where they can't climb out and can't preserve and protect themselves because they don't have the resources to do so. And I know that we keep saying that we're providing programs and we're providing initiatives to be able to assist them, but in reality, how are we getting to them? And I'm not quite sure I'm seeing that. I will say that I grew up in the inner city. I'm from Brooklyn. And so, and my mom still lives there, my family still lives there. And so if they don't have the resources to be able to protect themselves, and also just housing in general is costing so much that they're even being forced out of their neighborhoods, and they can't afford to be where they want to be. So it's a challenge, and I'm not quite sure how to answer that, but I hope that we find ways to make that connection and improve.
I concur. And I would, if I may, an example, and many of you will know the example, that in January of 2022, there was a fire in the Bronx that killed 17 people in a building. They saved many just because FDNY is so capable of that type of response. But the people who died in that building did not die on the fire floor. The fire was on the third floor. They all escaped. Everybody was out. The people who died in the stairwell, and they were on the upper floors. 13 to 15, because smoke moved through the building because there were no HVAC dampers, there were no self-closing doors in the stairwell. All of these things that went where the building failed before the fire department even got there. So these are the things we're talking about. These are the reasons that we have to keep fighting and keep advocating and keep educating, because people matter, and safe and affordable housing should not be mutually exclusive, to quote Dr. Martin. So last question, and then we're going to let you wrap. So you each have just a couple of statements here that you can make. How does the President's national initiative to advance building codes, how is it continue to change our conversations for building safety advocates across the U.S., particularly in our hazard-prone and underserved neighborhoods or our communities? So, Carl, we're going to start with you and go right down the end. How does this continue to make a difference? What are you going to do?
Well, we've got to keep our foot on the gas. I think, the short answer here is that there are doors open that have not been open previously. There are discussions being had at all levels of government now. We've got to be able to keep that momentum moving. And continue to do the learning and the education process that we've done for years now with the help from our federal, state, and local partners. So that's where I'm at on keeping our foot on the gas on the national initiative to advance building codes, and appreciate everything you and the administration have done.
Excellent, Carl. Thank you. Justin?
So from the emergency management perspective, I think one of the biggest thing that this has done is start to catalog many of the resources that can be used to help do pre-mitigation, but also the resources that can help enforce and support building codes for post-disaster work. There are so many out there, and with one person building official shops, one person emergency management shops, having that kind of a catalog and a guide as to what might make the most sense before and after disasters is huge. So that for us is one of the best pieces of this.
I like that, Justin. Mariah?
So from the local level, it coming from the White House, the National Initiative to Advance Building Codes means so much. It's the reason why we have Resilient Fairfax, and I challenge all localities to do a resilient, whatever your city is, so that you can emulate what is being pushed out from a higher level. And in doing so, you know, maybe we actually do see change.
Excellent, thank you. And Carlos, Dr. Martin.
I mentioned we're at crisis points. When you're at a crisis, you MacGyver, right? You bring in every tool that you have, and this is one tool that you can employ.
Excellent. I appreciate that very much. If you all will help me thank the panel. They did an excellent job. Very good. Very good. Excellent job. Thank you for that, everybody leaning into those questions. I really appreciate it. So with that, Dominic, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Doctor. Very much appreciated again. And thank you for running such a great panel discussion. I learned a lot. One thing I learned is FEMA is quite important, and I wanted to just recognize Ed Latch, who's been a friend and a very helpful person at the Code Council to help us get our message out, particularly during Building Safety Month. Thanks for being here, Ed. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. I hope you will consider joining us. We're going to have a little reception on the rooftop. But before I do that, I just want to mention, to get there, you go over the pedestrian bridge and look for one of our staff members that'll help you navigate to the reception. So with that, again, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Dr. Moore Merrill, and thank everyone again for being here this afternoon. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. Yeah, they had it in the back, so we'll figure it out. And then there's some media follow-up too, which is pretty cool. So we'll see how it all works out. All right, we'll go. And it needs to go upstairs. I have a trusty assistant.